Well, good afternoon, folks. I'm Dave Dietrich, and this is Welcome to One Work, 5 Questions with myself and Dr. Mark Andrew Polachek. I'm
I'm
Dave
playing
Dietrich.
with my tea bag, trying to get that started. Sometimes it's like trying to get a fire started, but
Uh, I'm Dave Dietrich, and I will be filling in for Donna Vitek, who is on scholarly hiatus. We don't know when she'll. Do you have any idea when she might be
I
back?
don't know. She's studying for some tests. She could be trafficking drugs for all I know, from all this the
Elusive.
secretive nature of all the things she's been telling me. I have no idea. She's a
Okay.
Floridian. You know, Floridians are very, very conniving people and cunning, conniving.
Now, just to give you all a little bit of background on us, if you haven't tuned in before. I'm a docent at a Thomas Jefferson historical site, as well as an amateur published historian. Mark he holds a PhD in history and philosophy. He taught at the University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University at Camden, and Ohio University. He has written over 26 books on the life and times of Thomas Jefferson and numerous articles as well.
27, David. Just got one
27
published.
as of
Yeah.
now. Okay. I forgot the one that was just approved. My apologies. Now, just the other day, we were looking at a good World War II movie that was made in 1965. So we're kind of moving around through history. So now today we're on talking about a article that was written, a letter actually, on 22 April 1820. And it is a letter that was written by Thomas Jefferson to a gentleman by the name of John Holmes. And we'll get into who he was in a moment. The central issue was the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and specifically dealing with the issue of states' rights, national, federal level power, and most importantly, perhaps the institution of slavery. And we'll see what Jefferson had to say about that, and maybe clear up some of the misunderstanding of what he said or what he did not say. So without further ado, I'll go to question number one. Okay, Mark?
All right.
Question number one, who exactly was John Holmes?
Well, let me go to screen share so I can bring up a picture of Holmes here. Give me a second here. Okay. Holmes was a lawyer and politician from Massachusetts. He was in the Massachusetts House of Representatives for 2 tenures, 1802 to 1803 and 1812 to 1813. And he was early on a Federalist who becomes a convert to Jeffersonian republicanism. That was nothing new because at the time the letter was writing, Jefferson's writing the letter, there are very few Federalists and many Republican Democrats of the Jeffersonian persuasion. He is part of the Massachusetts Senate in the years 1813 and 1816. He becomes part of the United States House of Representatives from 1817 to 1820, when this is the date of the letter, 1820, right?
Yes.
Most importantly, he is an agent on behalf of the Missouri Compromise. And he sent Jefferson, prior to Jefferson's letter here, a pamphlet where he talks about the importance of the compromise. And Jefferson is pleased with the pamphlet that Holmes sends. Holmes is, 1773 is his birth, so he's literally 30 years younger than Jefferson, so he's a much younger man than is Thomas. He will later become a member of the U.S. Senate. Okay, so the reason for his writing is in effect that he is a lawyer politician who's very much heavily invested in Maine becoming a new state. part of the Missouri Compromise is Missouri becoming a new state, Maine becoming a new state, Maine becoming a free state, and presumably Missouri becoming a slave state. And so he's actively involved in this issue, and it's just there's no reason, so Jefferson is clearly interested in this rising politician, interested in his own views and what he thinks of these issues here.
Okay, you ready for question 2?
I guess so.
All right. And what are some of the key takeaways in this letter? That's probably going to be more elaborate.
No, I mean, I'm just going to state what they are. We'll get into details later. I think the question admits it doesn't ask for details, for minutiae, so we'll talk of that, talk of the details insofar as they're relevant later on in some of the other questions. Presumably we'll get to them. The first thing I want to talk about, I'm always interested in Jefferson's manner of writing. He's a brilliant writer. He, like me, has a general detestation of metaphors. I really hate metaphors. I do. If you read any of my writings, I don't know if you ever notice, you notice my use of large words and in terms perhaps unfamiliar to other people, but you don't see me lapsing into metaphors very, very often. And when I do, it's probably because I had some bad bourbon the night before. That said, I don't even drink bourbon, but I detest metaphors. Being an analytic philosopher, and an analytic historian, I strive for precision and clarity of expression so far as I can achieve that. And I think metaphors always screw that up. Jefferson detests metaphors too. I don't know. He doesn't say he detests them, but I assume he does. He seldom uses them. Notice he says, I'm going to read some of these metaphors. Just kind of funny because why is he in his old age so interested? He says, I'm content to be a passenger in our bark to the shore, from which I am not distant, but this momentous question, like a fire bell in the night. There's a fire somewhere. Awaken and fill me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union. Then he goes and he says, we have the wolf by the ears. Another metaphor. So one, we have a large expression of numerous metaphors Jefferson employs. Why is he waxing metaphorically here to Holmes? I don't have a clue. Maybe it's senescence creeping on. I hope that in my older years I don't start using metaphors, but who knows?
We'll keep a record of that, though, of your use of metaphors.
You can, if you want to hold me to task on that. A second thing is something, of course, you're interested in, is express. I say express execration of slavery. I read from the letter, there's not a man on earth who would sacrifice more than I would to relieve us from this heavy reproach in any practicable way. The cession of that kind of property, for so it is misnamed, in other words, people are not property, is a bagatelle, a trifle, which would not cost me a second thought if in that way a general emancipation and expatriation could be effected, and gradually with due sacrifices, I think it might be. Again, you go on here, I'll just say a couple things. Why doesn't he do more to end slavery? He thinks there needs to be, he always says education, which costs a lot. You need to educate slaves. You need to free them, to emancipate them, educate them, and then expatriate them. He thinks the possibility of civil war is too great due to animosity in the slaves for having been treated as slaves for so long. It's a costly affair, and if anybody can come up with a way, we see by the Civil War, did they really come up with a way? They just decreed, Lincoln decreed, and in 1863, all slaves are free. And of course, that destroyed the South. Presumably that was what was happening in mind economically. It was not good for the country as a whole. Another issue is Jefferson, I'll talk of this later, looking at the Missouri problem as a political ruse by the North, right? The North has the advantage of 105 votes to 81 votes in the House of Representatives. They certainly want to keep that advantage. They're worried about any advantages that the South might gain by having more states carved out of the Western Territory, and those states being aligned to the South. Another issue about which we'll talk is Jefferson's insistence that the Union not dissolve. Why is that? In some of his letters, he says, look, it doesn't matter if it dissolves as long as the states into which the Union dissolves are Jeffersonian republics. Who cares, right? Idea is Jefferson is in this letter, and like in several other letters, indignant when he thinks of the possibility of dissolution of the nation. His experiment of government of and by the people, and the experiment, which he says in the second inaugural address, where the larger the area, the greater the chance of its success, right? Which is turning Aristotle on its head because we have representative government. And then the last issue about which we'll elaborate, I think you have a question on this, concerns states' rights. Jefferson is a champion of states' rights here.
Okay. Question 3?
2, I guess, right? That we just did. The first question just on who was Holmes was really a quasi question.
Oh, okay. Why is Jefferson so troubled by this compromise?
That's a really good question. I think one way to answer that is the tension marks a tension in his own mind, right? We have the tension. There's a certain amount of ravelment in Jefferson thinking, but he's troubled by this compromise. Look, Maine is going to be a free state. What about Missouri? That's the question. And in a lot of, when this is bandied about in the House of Republicans, House of Representatives rather, and in the Senate, the idea is, well, why does Missouri have to be a slave state? And one argument is we need to balance out the number of free states and slave states. And as we talked about before, Jefferson is chary about this proposed solution. As you mentioned before, because if we have this line at the 36.5 parallel across the whole continent, are we really solving the slavery issue? Or are we delaying it?
Exactly.
We're delaying it. So there is this tension in Jefferson's head because he is anti-slavery, and yet he's pro-states' rights. So there is. So what we get is great congressional debate on this issue. New York's James Talmadge in 1819, early in 1819, he proposes rather controversially with respect to the southern states that we have no more slave states, right? So Missouri can't be a slave state. And all children born to Missouri slaves, would be free at the age of 25. So he's going to allow that Missouri would be a slave state. But all the children born at the age of 25, born to slaves, would be free, in effect. So we're going to eradicate it that way. And then there are going to be no more slave states, however many other slave states we have. Now, this passes the House of Representatives, I mentioned before, because there are 105 votes in northern states, 80 in southern. So the North passes it. And in the House, it passes. In the Senate, it fails to pass, right? Talmadge proposal, what we're going to do about freeing slaves at the age of 25 and this compromise here. So we don't have a solution here till Illinois Senator Jesse B. Thomas proposes this line. And let me again try to get up a picture here. Suppose screen sharing. I'm a tyro when it comes to this kind of stuff, right? Let's look at this picture. I think everybody should be able to see it. Here's the 36.5 degree longitude line. Presumably that should stand all the way across. Missouri accepted. Missouri, you can see, is on top of that line. Missouri is admitted as a slave state in 1821. Up in the top right, we see Maine in 1820 as a free state. So the debate on Missouri, Maine is admitted in 1820. There's long debate on Missouri, and it is not decided to be a slave state till 1821. And as we were talking about before, going on the air, as it were, the Federalist Party was pretty much in disarray and almost all but absent at the time. Jefferson is worried that this is a ploy by Federalists to gain some sort of political power. The political power being is that instead of worrying about Republicans, Jeffersonian Republicans and Federalists, there are too few Federalists to fight, let's make this a North-South issue. So that way we can gather together the numerous Jeffersonian Republicans in the northern states, have them fight for a pro-anti-slavery or the anti-slavery agenda, whereas the Jeffersonian Republicans in the South. So in other words, we're going to split the Jeffersonian Republicans in half. And instead of making this a Federalist Republican debate, we're going to make this a North-South debate. And as we talked about prior to going on the air, really kind of interesting to think about this whole thing from the perspective in terms of creating a North and a South, different cultures, different attitudes. One is agrarian, the other is industrial, but yet we're going to make this issue political. One is anti-slavery, one is pro-slavery. So we're sort of forcing a political agenda, and Jefferson is worried about this being a Federalist ploy to separate the North from the South, and it scares the hell out of him that we might have that maybe some of the northern states might secede, or possibility of southern states seceding, or there being a war. His great experiment, as he calls it, right? The second revolution of 1800, while he's elected president, everything might fall apart. He's panicking. So much for that territory.
Yeah, that was even
Would
a
you
big
like
problem.
me to leave this picture up for further discussion? Or
Yeah, that'd be fine. I think that was a big issue, of course, during the War of 1812. The Northeast wanting to maybe secede.
Yeah, talk about the issue of secession, and that was an enormous problem, proposed by Southern states during the Civil War. The North prior to that, as you mentioned, 1812, and the idea of secession is something sort of guaranteed when you look at states as individually sovereign, and in a sense, the sovereignty of the states trumping the sovereignty of the federal government, which is something Jefferson is championing here. And so secession sort of follows from that, the notion that these are sort of loosely connected states that are sovereign. The federal government is just meant to handle foreign affairs for Jefferson and to assure individuals of their rights.
Yeah.
I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I think it does. Now, Jefferson seemed fearful that the dissolution of the Union might occur because of this legislation, the Missouri Compromise. Would you talk about the infamous diffusion argument in your answer? Now, that's an interesting term. Let's define that and discuss a little bit. How does that?
Well, I'll talk about that when we get to it. I want to expand on what that about which I talked in my prior answer, that Jefferson's profound worry of the dissolution of the Union. And he was always panicked about that because he wanted to see if, as he said in his second inaugural address, that the Union gets stronger by adding on new territory, because we have this divide again. We have the federal government attending to its business, the states attending, each of the states being sovereign, and attending to their business of states, and then counties doing their thing and wards doing their thing, and then the individual households. The idea being the states are sovereign for Jefferson, and the states can decide, sort of like individuals. The federal government has no business telling individuals how to run their lives. It has no business telling states how to do their business. And that's a good way to think about it. So Jefferson says this famous, we have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation in the other. Very important issue. And Jefferson, as governor, was a radical, strict constructionist of the Constitution. By the time he's president, he learns that there has to be some latitude in constructing, staying close to the dictates of the Constitution. Namely, and I wrote a paper on this that was published many years ago on Jefferson's, the lesson he learned from this is when the Union is threatened with dissolution or death, right, to adhere strictly to the Constitution is senseless. That's what he means by justice. Is on the one ear represents justice, the other is self-preservation, right? When two countries go to the war, one country attacks another, like Russia's gone, attacked Ukraine. Are you going to fight if they're trying to take over your country and make it part of their country? Are you supposed to fight the most moral war, or does anything go? In some sense, Jefferson is acknowledging that in some sense you got to ignore or overpass the rules to some extent, because if the country explodes or implodes, whatever you want to call it, there's no worry about whether you obey the Constitution. Now, he says in another letter, that's the wolf by the ears, so justice versus self-preservation. Self-preservation comes first. If you don't preserve the federal government, which comprises all the states, right, there can be no justice because there is no nation. He writes to Albert Gallatin later in the same year, December 26th, just after Christmas. And this where it becomes a political ploy. This is part of my book on Jefferson, on slavery and race that I published a few years ago. I talk about for Jefferson, this is a Federalist ploy. The party nears extinction. So what they do is they abandon the Whig versus Tory division, the Republican versus Federalist division, and they focus on a new division, slaveholding versus non-slave holding, as I put it. He writes to Gallatin, he says, moral, the question certainly is not. Want to make it look like, okay, people say we're fighting on behalf of slavery because we care about, all the rights of all people. Jefferson saying, no, the North doesn't care about that. Moral, the question certainly is not, because the removal of slaves from one state to another, no more than their removal from one country to another, would never make a slave of one human being who would not be so without it. Indeed, if there were any morality in the question, it is on the other side, because by spreading them over a larger surface, their happiness would be increased and the burden of their future liberation lightened by bringing a greater number of shoulders under it, right? So he says it's merely a question of power. He doesn't elaborate, but the idea is, here we get to the diffusion argument. Let me bring that up. The idea here, Jefferson talks about diffusion. What he means by diffusion is not allowing any more slaves, importation of slaves. So you're going to fix the number of slaves. Jefferson is arguing, I'll read in what he says in this letter. He says, of one thing I'm certain, that the passage of slaves from one state to another would not make a slave of a single human being who would not be so without it. So their diffusion over a greater surface would make them individually happier and proportionally facilitate the accomplishment of their emancipation by dividing the burden on a greater number of coadjutors. And I will share a screen again and bring this up if I can find it right here, what I just read. Okay. If you can see that, does that come up, Dave? Clear?
Yeah, it looks fine.
All right. That's the quote that I just read from the letter that were to Holmes. And the idea is scholars have taken this. I was at Poplar Forest and a professor from one of the Lynchburg colleges here said, well, Jefferson is just really confused because you can't get rid of slavery by spreading out the slaves. take an arbitrary number. If you have 1,000 slaves, you spread them out over greater territory, you diffuse them, you don't get rid of the institution. You have the same number of slaves. So how can Jefferson be so stupid? And this argument is repeated by a lot of historians for some reason. And I'm astonished at their puerility, at their ignorance, because Jefferson, who was an accomplished mathematician, who thought of math and geometry and trigonometry every day, clearly is not going to be arguing that that the institution will disappear by spreading out the number. If you have a certain number of molecules of air being dispersed in some other gas, you're still going to have in their dispersal the same number, just spread out. He's not arguing that. And by this diagram, trying to show if you look at having a certain number of slaves or X's in one place, 4, 3, 4, 5, and you spread them out. Well, what happens? One, the institution itself is less visible. Where if you have fewer slaves congregated in a smaller area, if they're spread out, you're not going to see the institution in all its might and splendor, right? It's spread out, so it's less visible as far as I'm saying. Number one, it's economically more feasible because in the first instance where it's not spread out, if I mandate some law or enact some law and say, okay, no more slavery, just as Lincoln did in 1863, then the people owning all these numbers of slaves where their money is invested simply go broke, belly up. And what happened in the South at all these plantations is they were ruined. Whereas if gradually you diffuse the slaves and some of them are allowed to go with relatives, it becomes easier to mandate a law saying, let's eliminate slavery at some point. It's going to be economically easier on the shoulders of people. And, in a sense, that's what Jefferson means by dividing the burden on a greater number of coadjutors, right? And then the third argument I have is that there's less dependency. What I mean by that is if at some point in time I lose some of my slaves and they move west, I have to make up that labor somehow, and I have become less dependent on the labor of slaves. I become, as a planter, more independent and thinking up clever ways to replace the labor of slaves with paid labor, whatever, right, without using slave labor. So I start getting my fingers dirty back in digging into the soil myself. So in some sense, I think the diffusion argument will facilitate a quicker pace, a rate for the emancipation of slavery at some time in the near future. Where if you don't have it, it's just going to be harder. The people who own slaves are going to be more intent. No, you can't take it from me. You'll destroy me. I mean, hope that makes sense, huh?
Yeah, you can see his thought process in that for sure. Absolutely.
And I'm just astonished that people can't, there's something called in philosophy the principle of charity, right? Meaning that if there are different ways of taking a passage, and one way of taking the passage makes someone look really stupid, don't interpret it that way. Be charitable. Assume that the person has some degree of rationality and take the argument in its most charitable. If it's ambiguous, take it in its be most charitable, take it in its most reasonable interpretation. So what historians are doing, and this is commonly done because historians are not charitable, they take it in its most egregiously ridiculous form, thinking Jefferson clearly doesn't understand that if you spread out 1 million slaves over, you still have 1 million slaves. How can he not see that? He's really stupid. Well, he wasn't so stupid. And that's not how you take the argument, as far as I'm concerned. That's not how Marcus Aurelius would take it either. So.
Oh, right. Meditations, dude.
Yes. Yeah, he's the dude. And one of my students at one point said, a first day of class, put his feet up on my desk and said, hey, philosopher dude, how's it going? That's the last time he ever talked like that to me. You can imagine the foul
Excellent.
words that came out of my mouth at that, and he was paranoid about saying anything the rest of the class would say.
But the last of the five good emperors, according to Gibbon.
Yeah.
So anyway, well, back to the 18th or early 19th century, actually. Question number 5. Given TJ's insistence that all people are created equal in the D&I, D of, what is that? D of I or D of?
Declaration.
Oh, okay. Declaration of Independence. All right. Now I get the code. I've cracked it. Why would he consider slavery a states' rights issue? You know, I've kind of talked about this to a degree, but can we elaborate on that a bit more?
Well, it's really a sort of an interesting issue. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, right off the bat, here's the thing. You take the Declaration face value.
Yeah.
He's enumerating certain rights inherent in all human beings by virtue of being human. One of which is that all people are created equal, right?
Correct.
Human equality is an assumption with which he begins. And you think that if that, from that you derive certain rights, life, liberty, pursuit of property, that because of human equality, that the issue of slavery is not to be bandied about and discussed by the states. So what do you think about that? I mean, it's certainly...
Well, yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying it's certainly a very strange... You'd think Jefferson would shut the door on them and say, okay, I'm a states' rights person, but not with respect to the issue of slavery. It's a moral issue.
Oh, I think you're right. I think there are two levels of analysis there. And from Jefferson's perspective, one is the moral issue, and you're right. And he made that clear in his later writings, among other things, that the institution of slavery was incompatible with the idea of God-given natural rights and natural law, and that applied to all people, not just certain people. And he was adamant about that.
Well,
so
let me add something before you go on. I don't mean to interrupt, but
sure.
I've said this before, and it's astonishing me how many Jeffersonian scholars are clearly unaware in his first draft that he absolutely includes all people, blacks included. He says capital M, capital E, capital N are bought and sold. How many people never read that and say, oh, Jefferson did not mean this to apply to blacks? And that's bullshit.
Exactly.
Really.
He did. Absolutely, he did. Then the other element was, I would submit, is how he and Madison and others viewed the states. And that was that they were part of the United States of America. Absolutely no question about that. But they were also each one a separate republic, constitutional republic in their own right. That doesn't mean that they overrode the value and the responsibilities of the federal government. Not saying that. What they were saying was, you're not dealing with just one republic, one constitutional republic. You're dealing with how many ever, whatever the number of states were at that time. Certainly not 50, but today we have 50 republics. We have one federal republic at the national level, and the other half of that are the 50 republics that we have in the form of the states.
Yeah, Jefferson was a states' rights person. He wasn't really forced to think about this till the Adams administration, and you get the Alien Sedition Act and so forth, and that's when he really articulates in his response to that Kentucky resolutions, the notion of states being sovereign. In this letter, he writes, to regulate the condition of the different descriptions of men composing a state, this certainly is the exclusive right of every state, with nothing in the Constitution as taken from them and given to the general government. So in other words, let me sort of change something you said, or at least put a different emphasis on it, that Jefferson thought that the role of the federal government was foreign affairs and preservation of individual rights. That's it.
Yeah.
Everything else, states were sovereign, which meant in some sense that the individual states was its own, it's sovereign, its own force. It was viable in and of itself. And the federal government's job was to stay out of it.
Yep.
Now, the question here is, what do you do about the issue of slavery? And Jefferson, because he says all people are created equal, right off the bat, you'd think by moral fiat that you're going to eliminate discussion of slavery at the state level. Namely, it's going to be mandated if you need to do it by the federal government, if only because this is a moral consideration, given the belief, at least in the notion that all people are in some fundamental sense equal. And I think the equality he has in mind is moral equality. We all have a moral sense, and that moral sense tells us the right thing to do. We feel it, and through that moral sense, we feel, this is a weird thing to say, feel the existence of God. Something I stumbled upon recently. What separates Jefferson in the moral sense, because he talks about the moral sense, a sense that other animals, bees, other sorts of pack animals or herd animals, and things like that, penguins, puffins, they do not have a sense of God. They do not sense God. We directly sense God. We don't analogically. So that what separates us. It does make us special, at least perhaps in the universe. So in my estimation, this is a very strange, we're at the 2-minute warning here. Does that mean we have a timeout when we get to 2 minutes?
Yeah, we got to kick a field goal soon
to win the game. Or throw for the end zone. I don't have any comments that are going to be touchdown-like, but I'll try. What I think Jefferson is doing here is he's realizing the wolf by the ears, justice and self-preservation. Justice means slavery should be abolished across the board. I say that in my declaration. At this point, it's such a critical time in the country's history that justice shouldn't be considered, self-preservation first. The country needs to stay alive. So we need to make sure that happens. So we need to make concessions and compromises in the short term so that we can, at the right point, eliminate slavery in the long term, whenever that's going to be. Jefferson didn't think it was going to happen in his lifetime. So it's a short-term concession towards vice and what is morally wrong. And I'll say this rather puzzlingly, Jefferson thought, there were no moral absolutes. Something that is by principle morally right, like the existence of slavery is wrong, being Jefferson an absolute principle. But at times where slavery is practiced, you can't just get rid of it. It's probably the wrong thing to do at the wrong time. If you don't do it at the right time, cause more harm than good. So that's that. I think it's just a short-term concession.
Yeah.
I mean, you have a wrap on this. We're down to 1 minute. I'll give you some parting words on this.
I mean, to me, it makes sense. It does. And it's a really tough call when you think about what he had to go through with looking at that moral argument from both levels of government. And the best of all worlds, I get the best of all possible worlds is that the federal and the state,
possible.
Exactly, the federal
Mr.
and the state governments are going to operate the same. Thanks, are going to operate the same. But
this is David's gloss over thing, or his pan gloss.
Excellent, thank you. I walked into that one.